The man who saved America won the war and lost everything after it. Not on a battlefield, not at the hands of an enemy. Right here, in a wood-paneled room in Washington, D.C., by the government he had served, using the secrets he had created, read back to him in a proceeding designed to look like justice and built to guarantee a verdict. That is not the Cold War story you were taught. The version you got probably ended somewhere around 1945 with the bomb and the surrender and the ticker tape parades. The version that got left out is the one that tells you something true about how power actually works. Not in dictatorships, not in history books, but here, in America, in the machinery that decides who gets to speak and who gets silenced. Robert Oppenheimer built the weapon that ended World War II. He delivered it ahead of schedule. He ran a secret city of 6,000 people in the New Mexico desert, a city that did not officially exist, in a location that did not appear on any map. And he did it so well that when the bomb finally worked, the military men who had doubted him could not find the words to describe what he had accomplished. He gave America the most powerful weapon in human history. And then he said it was a mistake to keep building more of them. That was his crime. Not espionage, not passing documents, not meeting with Soviet agents in parking garages. He stood in front of committees and gave lectures at universities and wrote papers for journals and said, with the full force of the authority he had earned by building the thing, that the arms race it had started was going to destroy the country it was supposed to protect. He said it clearly. He said it repeatedly. He said it to people who had the power to make him stop. So they made him stop. Lewis Strauss ran the Atomic Energy Commission. He had been in the room in 1949 when Oppenheimer appeared before a congressional committee and, not with cruelty, not with any apparent awareness of the damage he was doing, but with that particular precision that belonged to men who had spent their lives thinking faster than everyone else in the room, made Strauss look like he did not understand the subject he was supposed to be overseeing. The room had laughed. Strauss had not laughed. And 5 years later, when Strauss had the power and Oppenheimer needed a clearance renewal, the file that had been accumulating for over a decade was opened, a prosecutor was hired, and a room was prepared on Constitution Avenue. The question the government put on the table was whether Oppenheimer was a security risk. The question underneath that question, the one nobody wrote down, was whether a man who had built the most powerful weapon in history had the right to say what it should and should not be used for. The answer America gave in 1954 is the reason this story matters right now, today, in your world, not just in a history textbook. Because the mechanism that destroyed Oppenheimer did not shut down when the hearing ended. It became a template. Before we go any further, if you are not subscribed, do it now. This channel covers the stories that got edited out of the version you were given, and this one goes places the textbooks never did. Hit the bell, drop a comment, tell me where you are watching from and what time it is. Now, back to the desert. Back to the beginning of the most consequential story in modern American history. The apartment was on Riverside Drive in Manhattan, on the Upper West Side, and the family that lived there had arrived from Germany a generation earlier, with nothing, and had built a fortune in the textile trade, and had hung the walls with original paintings by Van Gogh and Picasso. Not reproductions, the actual canvases, because they believed that surrounding a child with beauty was not a luxury, but an obligation. Julius Robert Oppenheimer was born into that apartment on April 22, 1904. His father believed a son could become anything if you gave him room to think. His mother was a painter. And Robert turned out to be one of those children who arrives in the world already assembled, already somewhere ahead of the adults working to keep up with him. He was reading Greek and Roman philosophers in the original languages by the time he was 9. He collected minerals with the obsessive precision of a scientist who already understood that the physical world had a structure, and that the structure could be known. He wrote letters to the New York Mineralogical Club, so technically sophisticated that the members assumed they were corresponding with a grown professional. They invited him to lecture. He arrived, and the room went quiet when they saw who had walked through the door. He finished his entire school program years ahead of schedule, entered Harvard at 18, and decided on his own that the standard 4-year program was too slow. He completed it in 3, taking 6 courses a semester, graduating summa cum laude in chemistry, with a deep, self-taught foundation in theoretical physics. He was already thinking about what came next, and what came next was Europe. The 1920s in Germany were, for physics, what Renaissance Florence was for painting. Quantum mechanics was being born, not an addition to the old Newtonian picture of the universe, but the demolition of it, and the construction in its place of something unrecognizable. The center of this revolution was the University of Göttingen, where Max Born had built what was effectively the finest theoretical physics program on Earth. Oppenheimer went there in 1926 at 22 years old, and he arrived into a seminar room that contained Werner Heisenberg, Wolfgang Pauli, Paul Dirac, Enrico Fermi, and a young Hungarian physicist named Edward Teller. He did not ease in. He dominated. He was so relentlessly present, so quick to take over the blackboard mid-sentence, so constitutionally unable to let an argument go unchallenged, that a petition circulated among the other students threatening to boycott the seminars unless someone slowed him down. Max Born solved it by leaving the petition on his desk, where Oppenheimer could see it. Oppenheimer read it, went quiet for a day, and was never quite that bad again. He earned his doctorate in March of 1927. His oral examiner walked out afterward and said to a colleague, "I am glad that is over." He was on the verge of asking me questions. He came back to America a physicist of the first rank, took a position at Berkeley in 1929, and spent the next decade building what became the finest school of theoretical physics in the United States. His students copied his walk, his way of lighting a cigarette, his habit of quoting Sanskrit poetry in the middle of equations. They called him Oppie. He read 6 languages. He could recite Proust from memory. He drove too fast, smoked too much, and sometimes forgot to eat for so long that colleagues genuinely worried he might disappear. Underneath all of it, underneath the brilliance and the charisma and the terrifying speed of his mind, there was something that the people closest to him could feel but struggled to name. A hunger that never quieted. A need to prove something that success never fully satisfied. A brittleness that the gift did not protect him from, and may have actually intensified. He was not easy to be around, and he did not particularly need anyone to find him easy. He had decided, somewhere along the way, that the cost of being exactly himself was a price he was willing to pay. That quality, the refusal to perform a softer version of his own certainty, would become the most important fact about him. Not at Berkeley. Later, in the places where certainty was dangerous. In December of 1938, in a laboratory in Berlin, 2 chemists split the uranium atom. The physicists understood immediately what had happened. The energy locked inside a small piece of uranium, not chemical energy, not the energy of burning, but something that lived at the level where matter and energy are the same thing, was so concentrated that a piece you could hold in your hand contained the destructive potential of thousands of tons of conventional explosive. The physicists who understood this most urgently were the ones who had the most personal reason to fear it. A significant number of the world's leading nuclear scientists were European Jews who had fled Nazi Germany. Men and women who knew what Berlin was capable of, and who now faced the specific, technical, nauseating possibility that the regime that had driven them from their homes might soon have access to a weapon that made every weapon in history look like a warning. By 1941, that fear had reached Washington. By 1942, the decision had been made. The United States would build an atomic bomb. The question was, who would run it? General Leslie Groves was a large, blunt, impatient man who had just overseen the construction of the Pentagon in 16 months and had consequently developed strong opinions about what was and was not impossible on a deadline. He needed a scientific director for the central laboratory where the bomb would actually be designed and built. He had a list of candidates. He considered them all. He kept coming back to Oppenheimer, despite a security file already thick enough to give a serious man serious pause. Groves read the file. The communist associations, the girlfriend who was a party member, the brother and sister-in-law who were party members, the donations to left-wing causes, the meetings of communist-affiliated organizations at Berkeley were all there. Groves made a calculation that would determine the next 3 years of human history. Oppenheimer is absolutely essential to the project. He wrote it in a memo. He effectively overruled every security objection with 5 words. On a train from Chicago to New York in October of 1942, he offered Oppenheimer the job. Oppenheimer proposed the location himself, the high desert of New Mexico, near a flat-topped mountain he had known since childhood, where a boys' school sat surrounded by pine forest and the kind of silence that has actual weight. He had ridden horses there. He had loved it. And it was, by any practical measure, exactly right. Remote enough to keep secrets, far enough from any population center that the catastrophic accident everyone quietly feared would kill as few people as possible. They took the school, gave the families a few weeks to leave, and began to build a city that would not exist. At its peak, roughly 6,000 people lived inside a fence that appeared on no official map, in a town with no name, working on a project referred to only as the Manhattan Engineering District. Babies born there had Santa Fe listed as their birthplace. The scientists who arrived from universities across the country and from European countries that had tried to kill them found something that was simultaneously a frontier settlement, a graduate seminar, and a military installation. The roads turned to mud in rain and dust in sun. The housing was bad. The security checks were constant. You could not tell your family where you were. You could not write a letter that said anything true. What held it together was Oppenheimer. Viktor Weisskopf, who was present for most of it, tried to describe it years afterward. He was intellectually and physically present at every decisive step. His continuous and intense presence, the feeling that he was interested in everything and aware of everything, created in all of us a feeling of direct participation. He absorbed the problems, theoretical, engineering, metallurgical, explosive, problems that had no names yet because no one had encountered them before. And he held them all in his head simultaneously, making connections that the specialists working inside their individual disciplines could not see from where they stood. He was also getting thinner. The weight kept coming off through the final year of the project. He was well under 120 pounds by the spring of 1945, at nearly 6 feet tall. He smoked constantly. He slept badly. He was carrying something that everyone around him could feel, the knowledge of what this thing would do when it was finished. By the summer of 1945, Los Alamos had produced a device that its creators called the gadget, because calling it what it actually was felt like crossing a line that could not be uncrossed. The test site was in the Jornada del Muerto Desert in New Mexico. The name translates from the Spanish as Journey of the Dead Man. Nobody thought much about that at the time. Oppenheimer had slept perhaps 4 hours the night before. He was standing in a concrete bunker roughly 6 miles from a 100-foot steel tower with the device on top of it. The countdown had already been stopped once. Thunderstorms. Because you do not detonate an experimental nuclear weapon during lightning, because that particular mistake does not offer a second chance. The storm passed. The count resumed. At 5:29 and 45 seconds on the morning of July 16, 1945, the circuit closed. The flash was not light in any sense that the word normally carries. It was brighter than anything the human eye is built to process. A white that seemed both instantaneous and endless. The steel tower evaporated. Not collapsed, evaporated. The shock wave crossed the desert floor like something physical, like a wall you could have reached out and touched. The sound arrived seconds later, a crack and a rumble that people felt in their chests before they heard it in their ears, and it bounced off the mountains and came back again. Isidore Rabi was standing at a greater distance. He watched Oppenheimer walk out of the shelter after the blast. "I'll never forget his walk," Rabi said decades later. "He walked like Gary Cooper in high noon, like a man who had gotten exactly what he wanted." What was moving through Oppenheimer's mind in that moment, nobody will ever entirely know. His brother Frank, who was standing nearby, remembered something simpler than poetry. Robert turned to him and said, "It worked." The line he eventually settled on, the one that became permanent vocabulary of the century, came from the Bhagavad Gita, the ancient Hindu scripture he had read in the original Sanskrit. He recalled the god Vishnu taking on his terrible form to tell the warrior prince Arjuna that the battle must be fought. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." He did not say it in the desert that morning. He said it years later in an interview, with the controlled precision of a man who had spent a long time searching for the right words. 3 weeks after Trinity, Little Boy fell on Hiroshima. 3 days after that, Fat Man fell on Nagasaki. Together, the two weapons killed somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 people, most of them civilians. Many of them died instantly, a word that does not capture what instantly meant in that context. Others died over days and weeks, from burns and radiation sickness that the doctors treating them had no framework to understand. Oppenheimer was at Los Alamos when the news from Hiroshima arrived. He walked onto the stage in the main auditorium, raised his clasped hands above his head in the gesture of a winning boxer, and the crowd cheered. He expressed regret that the bomb had not been ready in time to use against Germany. But what happened inside him over the weeks that followed was not something the crowd had seen coming. The elation curdled. The man who had walked like Gary Cooper started to look like someone carrying something he could not put down, could not hand to anyone else, could not set on a shelf and walk away from. He went to Washington and told Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War, that atomic weapons had to be brought under international control before they proliferated. He went to the White House and sat across from Harry Truman and said he felt he had blood on his hands. Truman, by several accounts, was not moved by this. He later told Dean Acheson he never wanted to see that son of a bitch in his office again. He had made the decision to use the bombs deliberately and without flinching, and a physicist telling him about blood on his hands was not a moral statement to Truman. It registered as an accusation, and Harry Truman did not take accusations from people who had not been elected to anything. Oppenheimer was not invited back to the White House. He became chairman of the General Advisory Committee of the Atomic Energy Commission and used that platform with a precision that made certain people in Washington very uncomfortable. He argued for civilian oversight of nuclear weapons. He argued for international control of nuclear energy. He pushed for negotiations with the Soviets on a framework for inspection. He gave speeches. He wrote papers in language accessible enough that the public could read them. He believed, and this belief never softened in him, not through the hearing, not through the clearance revocation, not through any of it, that if you understood something clearly, you had a responsibility to say it clearly. Not diplomatically, clearly. In August of 1949, the Soviets detonated their first atomic device in a remote stretch of Kazakhstan, and the monopoly that had been the organizing assumption of every American military plan since 1945 vanished in a single morning. The generals who had predicted the Soviets needed another decade had been wrong by roughly 9 years. The immediate response in certain corners of the defense establishment was the response you would predict. If we cannot hold a monopoly on this weapon, we build a bigger one. The hydrogen bomb, the thermonuclear weapon that fused atoms together rather than splitting them, using a fission explosion merely as the trigger, releasing energy on a scale that made Hiroshima look like a demonstration round, had been a theoretical obsession of Edward Teller's since the Manhattan Project. Now, suddenly, it was urgent. Oppenheimer's General Advisory Committee met in October of 1949 to answer the question directly. Should the United States pursue an emergency crash program to build a thermonuclear weapon? The committee voted unanimously against it. In the main report, they argued the strategic case, that expanding the existing fission arsenal served American security better than a race toward a weapon of incomprehensible, destructive scale. In a separate annex signed by Fermi and Rabi, two of the most credentialed nuclear scientists alive, the language was starker. They called the hydrogen bomb a weapon of genocide. They said its only plausible military purpose was the mass extermination of civilian populations. They said the United States should declare it would not build this weapon and invite other nations to make the same commitment. Oppenheimer signed the main report. He chaired the committee that produced the annex. Truman overrode the committee entirely on January 31, 1950, and ordered the hydrogen bomb program to proceed. The committee's report was classified, but Washington leaks in ways that matter. And within weeks, the people who needed to know what Oppenheimer had argued knew it. Edward Teller knew it. Lewis Strauss knew it. And the FBI file on Oppenheimer, already substantial, got heavier. Now, to understand what came next, you need to understand who Strauss actually was. Because the version of him that appears in the official history of this period is considerably flatter than the man who sat across from Oppenheimer in various Washington rooms over a decade and built, with methodical patience, the case that would end him. Lewis Strauss had grown up in Virginia, the son of a shoe wholesaler, and had educated himself past his origins with a discipline that was almost physical in its intensity. He had no scientific training. He had made his money on Wall Street, served in a naval intelligence role during the Second World War, and arrived in Washington's atomic energy apparatus through the specific combination of financial success and political connection that opens those particular doors. He was intelligent, well-read, and acutely sensitive to the question of whether the people in a room respected him, which is the kind of sensitivity that, in powerful men, tends to produce very specific kinds of action when the answer is no. The moment that mattered happened in 1949, before a Senate committee. Oppenheimer was testifying about the military significance of radioactive isotopes, specifically about whether certain isotopes being exported to Norway were a potential security threat, as Strauss had been publicly claiming. Oppenheimer disagreed with Strauss's assessment. He made his disagreement clear with the particular brand of precision he reserved for arguments he considered important. He said, in front of the committee and the observers and the reporters, that you could use a shovel or a bottle of beer to transmit nuclear energy in the sense Strauss was describing, that the framing of the threat was technically incoherent. The room had laughed. Strauss sat there and did not laugh. It was not, in isolation, an extraordinary moment. Scientists correct non-scientists in public all the time. What made it extraordinary was the combination of audience, Congress, the press, Strauss's peers, and the nature of the correction, which was not just factual, but effectively a demonstration that the man in charge of atomic energy policy did not understand the physics he was supposed to be overseeing. Strauss understood exactly what had happened, and he was not a man who forgot those moments. He filed them. He became chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission in 1953, when Eisenhower came to the White House. He moved carefully, the way you move when you understand that you only get one real attempt. He cultivated relationships with FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who had his own file on Oppenheimer going back to the Berkeley years. He watched the political climate, the McCarthy hearings, the Rosenberg executions, the national mood of suspicion and fear that had made quote, _3, the most effective 2 words in Washington. And he recognized that the timing was right. In November of 1953, a man named William Borden sent a letter to Hoover. Borden was the former executive director of the Congressional Joint Committee on Atomic Energy, and he had spent years reading the FBI's Oppenheimer file. His letter stated, in careful language, that based on his review, it was more probable than not that Robert Oppenheimer had been, and perhaps remained, a Soviet intelligence agent. Borden had no new evidence. Not a single document, not a single witness, not a single intercepted communication that had not been in the file for years. What he had was a reframing. The same old facts arranged in a new pattern with new emphasis, at a moment when the political context would let that pattern do the work that evidence alone could not. Eisenhower acted within days. He ordered what he called a blank wall placed between Oppenheimer and all classified material. Oppenheimer's clearance was suspended before he had been told he was under investigation. 4 days before Christmas, they sat him down and handed him a document listing 34 specific allegations against him. He could walk away quietly, they said. Sign a paper, resign his consultancies, and the whole thing would be over. He sat with a friend that evening and took some sleeping pills that were not prescribed to him. His friend found him collapsed against a bathroom door later that night. They kept him awake with coffee until morning. When the light came, he made his decision. He was going to fight. The hearing opened on April 12, 1954, in room 2022 of Building T3 on Constitution Avenue, a squat, temporary wartime structure that had never quite gotten around to being demolished. No windows, fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly ill, a long table, folding chairs, 3 men on the Personnel Security Board, and a prosecutor named Roger Robb, who had been brought in specifically because of his skill at a very particular kind of cross-examination. Robb had read the complete file. He had access to transcripts of phone calls that Oppenheimer did not know had been recorded, including conversations between Oppenheimer and his own defense attorney. Conversations that should have been protected by attorney-client privilege and were not. Because this was not a court. It was a security hearing. Security hearings operated by rules that Strauss had helped write, and those rules were very precisely calibrated to look like due process without requiring its substance. Oppenheimer's lawyers had been given access to some documents related to the case. Not all of them. Certain classified materials that the prosecution intended to use were withheld from the defense, meaning that Robb could spring arguments that the defense attorneys had not been permitted to prepare for. And in certain moments during the hearing, Oppenheimer himself, the subject of the proceeding, the man whose career was on the table, was required to leave the room when classified evidence was being discussed, because his clearance had already been suspended. He was not authorized to hear the evidence being used against him. If you are trying to find an analogy for that, reach for whatever comes naturally. A chess match where your opponent can move your pieces when you step away from the board. A courtroom where the rules apply to everyone except the people who wrote them. Rob walked Oppenheimer through the Chevalier affair with the patient, methodical rhythm of a man who knows exactly where every floorboard squeaks. The affair itself was this. In the winter of 1943, Håkon Chevalier, a Berkeley literature professor, a socialist, a genuine friend of many years, came to Oppenheimer's house for dinner. And in the kitchen, while Oppenheimer was making drinks, Chevalier mentioned that a man named George Eltonton had suggested a possible channel for passing technical information to Soviet contacts through a consulate official. Chevalier framed it as a question rather than a proposal. Oppenheimer said no, emphatically, and told him the entire idea was potentially treasonous. Chevalier nodded. They went back to the dinner party. Oppenheimer had a security reporting obligation. He fulfilled it badly. He told the security officer there had been contact attempts involving several scientists, declined to name Chevalier, gave a vague account clearly designed to flag a concern without destroying a friend he believed was not actually a spy. When pressed over subsequent months, he eventually told the whole story, named Chevalier, and admitted that the earlier account had been, in his own word, a fabrication. The investigation had accepted this. Chevalier was cleared of espionage. The affair was officially closed. Except that it was never closed. Rob knew this. He walked Oppenheimer through every version of the story across the years, holding the small inconsistencies up to the fluorescent light, letting them accumulate. When Oppenheimer's memory of a conversation from 11 years ago differed slightly from a previous account, Rob noted it with the quiet satisfaction of a man collecting precisely what he came for. He was not trying to prove espionage. He was trying to build a portrait of a man whose word could not be trusted. And the Chevalier affair, told in Rob's sequence, with Rob's emphasis, in front of a board that had not been constituted to find Oppenheimer innocent, was exactly the right material for that portrait. The defense witnesses came. Hans Bethe sat in the folding chair and said without qualification that Oppenheimer was the most trustworthy scientist he had known. Isidore Rabi said that no one who had actually worked alongside Oppenheimer could seriously entertain the suggestion that he was disloyal. George Kennan gave a defense so articulate and comprehensive that the room was briefly silent after he finished. The defenders were distinguished, credible, and numerous. The arithmetic of the proceeding was not about their number. Edward Teller arrived in Washington on April 28th. He had known Oppenheimer since Göttingen, or close to it. More than 20 years of shared seminars, shared arguments, shared late nights in laboratory buildings with bad coffee and extraordinary physics. They had disagreed sharply, frequently, and in both directions. Teller was not a man who experienced disagreement as a social transaction. He experienced it as a collision of certainties, and Oppenheimer had certainties of his own. But they had been colleagues. By any reasonable definition, before the spring of 1954, they had been something like friends. Teller's grievance was real, even if what he did with it was not defensible. At Los Alamos, his ideas about thermonuclear fusion had been deferred, not dismissed, not ridiculed, but placed on a lower shelf, while the more immediate problem of the fission bomb was solved. Oppenheimer had managed this with diplomatic precision, giving Teller unusual freedom to work on what interested him, while the rest of the laboratory focused on the weapon that needed to exist in 1945, rather than the weapon that might exist in 1952. Teller did not experience this as accommodation. He experienced it as being sidelined while other men got the credit for ending the war. When the hydrogen bomb debate began in earnest after the Soviet test, and Oppenheimer chaired the committee that recommended against an emergency crash program, Teller heard it the only way a man with that particular wound could hear it, as Oppenheimer doing to his weapon what Oppenheimer had done to his ideas at Los Alamos. One more deferral. One more dismissal dressed in the language of strategic calculation. Whether that reading was fair is a question the historical record does not resolve cleanly. What the record does resolve is what Teller said in room 2022 on April 28th, and the care with which he chose his words. He did not say traitor. He did not say spy. He did not make a direct accusation that could be challenged on its facts. He said he found certain of Oppenheimer's behaviors, in unspecified instances, hard to understand. He said he would personally feel more secure if the vital interests of the country rested in other hands. He said he could not speak to Oppenheimer's loyalty, but that he would prefer to see American security entrusted to someone whose judgment he found more reliable. Preferred. Would feel more comfortable, personally speaking. Every word was technically true. Every word was precisely calibrated to do maximum damage while remaining individually deniable. In a hearing where character testimony carried the weight of evidence, where the question was not what Oppenheimer had provably done, but whether he could be trusted, the statement __quote_5__ from a man who had worked alongside Oppenheimer for 2 decades was not a personal observation. It was a verdict in the language of preference. Teller walked out of the building and past a group of scientists who had come to testify for the defense. One of them, accounts name him as Beta, extended his hand. Teller reached for it. The man withdrew his hand and turned away. Nobody spoke. The scientific community's response was total and lasting. Former colleagues refused to acknowledge him at conferences. His name became shorthand for betrayal in laboratories from Berkeley to Cambridge. He spent the following decades insisting he had said nothing false, that he had been placed in an impossible position, that he had answered honestly under oath. He was not wrong that his individual words were defensible. He was also not wrong that he had understood exactly what they would do. He was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2003. He died 6 days later. He never resolved, in any public statement, what it had cost him to choose that particular truth, in that particular room, at that particular moment. Gordon Gray signed the Personnel Security Board's report on May 27, 1954. 21 pages, in the careful, measured language of men who understand that the most devastating verdicts are the ones that sound reasonable. The board found, 2-1, that Oppenheimer's clearance should not be reinstated. They were explicit that they did not find him disloyal. They did not call him a spy. They acknowledged his extraordinary contributions to American science and American security. They acknowledged that his communist associations were old, largely explained, consistent with the political culture of his time and place. They acknowledged that no single element of the case against him constituted proof of anything decisive. And then they said he lacked character, that his behavior had shown, in the word they selected with precision, defects. That a man who had been less than fully forthcoming with security officers years ago, who had opposed a weapons program his government ultimately pursued, who had made judgments that differed from his superiors, could not be trusted with American secrets. Whatever his brilliance, whatever his service, whatever he had built, and whoever he had saved. The dissent came from Ward Evans, the one scientist on the board, a chemist from Northwestern who had entered the hearing prepared to find Oppenheimer guilty and had spent the weeks of testimony arriving somewhere else. Evans wrote that the board's reasoning, applied consistently, would bar from government service virtually every scientist who had ever held an unpopular opinion about nuclear policy. He wrote that the charges were, in his assessment, flimsy. He wrote that he was troubled by what the finding would signal to the scientific community about the cost of honest disagreement with power. Nobody in a position of authority read Evans's dissent with any care. The Atomic Energy Commission reviewed the board's recommendation and issued its own ruling in late June. The vote was 4-1. Henry DeWolf Smith, the Princeton physicist who had written the official government history of the Manhattan Project, cast the single dissent. He wrote that the finding rested primarily on the Chevalier incident, which had been known to the government for over a decade and had never previously been treated as disqualifying. He wrote that the majority's logic, if applied uniformly, meant a man's usefulness to his government was permanently hostage to the worst judgment call he had ever made, even if it had been fully disclosed, fully investigated, and previously resolved. He wrote that he feared the commission was establishing a precedent that would make honest scientists afraid to say what they believed. He was right. It did. The phrase the commission used was security risk, two words that floated between accusation and verdict, that sounded like a factual finding, while being in practice a judgment of character, one that could not be appealed in any legal sense, because there was no legal proceeding to appeal. There was a board and a commission and a finding, and a man who had been cleared and was now uncleared, and the door between him and the machinery of American national security was locked from the outside. Oppenheimer did not pursue further recourse. He went back to his directorship of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, where Einstein had spent his last years, and where the absence of security clearances and classified briefings and rooms full of men with files was something he had probably never valued more than he valued it that summer. He was 50 years old. He kept teaching, he kept writing, he kept thinking. His phone was tapped for years afterward. His mail was still read. The conversations he had in his office, in his home, in restaurants and faculty lounges, still monitored by people he could not see, whose reports went into a file that kept growing, even though the finding had already been issued and there was, officially, nothing left to adjudicate. What was buried in room 2022 in the spring of 1954 was not one man's career, though that burial was real and it mattered. It was something larger, and the size of it only becomes visible when you look at what American nuclear policy became in the decade that followed, and ask who was not in the room when those decisions were made. The idea that died was specific, that the people who built the weapons should have a seat at the table where the weapons' use was decided. Not the final seat. Nobody, not even Oppenheimer, was arguing that physicists should run foreign policy. But a seat, a formal channel, an institutional recognition that the judgment of people who understood the physics and the consequences was relevant to the question of what to do with what they had built. Before the hearing, that idea was imperfect and frequently overruled, but it existed. There were committees. There were clearances that permitted access. There was a man who could walk into the State Department or the Pentagon and say, with the full weight of Los Alamos behind him, that the trajectory of American nuclear policy was heading somewhere catastrophic, and the men in those rooms would listen, even when they disagreed, even when they said no. They listened because the access existed, because the relationship between the scientific community and the national security apparatus, however tense, was intact. After June of 1954, it was not intact. The message that reached the scientific community was not subtle. It did not need to be subtle. The most eminent physicist in America had been stripped of his clearance for arguing, through legitimate official channels, against a weapons program. He had been subjected to a proceeding that used his private conversations against him, withheld evidence from his defense, and judged him not on what he had demonstrably done, but on what he had believed, what he had argued, where his conscience had led him when he looked at what he had built and thought honestly about what it meant. If it could happen to him, it could happen to anyone who held a clearance and an opinion that someone in power found inconvenient. Herbert York was present at many of the key decisions of the 1950s and 60s as the hydrogen bomb program accelerated and the arsenal expanded, and the logic of assured mutual destruction became the organizing principle of American security. He spent the later part of his career writing about what that era had felt like from the inside. He wrote about the hearing, about Oppenheimer, about what the scientific community internalized after 1954. He wrote that the dialogue that might have existed, the genuine, contentious, productive argument between the people who understood the physics and the people making the policy, was replaced by a different kind of conversation. One where scientists who wanted continued access learned the parameters that access required, and the ones who would not work within those parameters lost the access and, with it, any ability to influence the decisions that mattered. York called it, in a phrase that deserves more attention than it has received, the closing of the American scientific mind on the question of nuclear weapons. Not the end of brilliant science. The laboratories kept running, the weapons kept being built, the physics kept advancing. The end of something more important than technical progress. The end of institutionalized, honest doubt. The end of the permission to say, from inside the cleared world where the real decisions happened, that the direction was wrong. Oppenheimer had been the last person with both the standing and the willingness to say it. He said it. They took the standing away. In 1963, John F. Kennedy authorized the Atomic Energy Commission to award Oppenheimer the Enrico Fermi Award, the highest honor the commission could bestow. Kennedy was killed before the ceremony. Lyndon Johnson presented it in December of that year, in a room at the White House attended by nearly everyone who had played a significant role in this story. Lewis Strauss was not there. He said he was otherwise engaged. Strauss had tried to be confirmed as Secretary of Commerce in 1959. The Senate rejected him 49-46. The first cabinet nomination rejected by the Senate in more than 3 decades. During the confirmation hearings, Senator Clinton Anderson had walked Strauss through a series of statements and documents with a methodical patience that anyone who had watched Roger Robb at work would have recognized immediately. The inconsistencies accumulated. The portrait that emerged was of a man whose relationship with the truth was highly situational. Strauss never held a significant government position again. Oppenheimer stood in the White House that December afternoon. Thin, already ill, though the diagnosis would not be confirmed for another 2 years, and accepted a medal from the commission that had destroyed him, in the building where Truman had told him never to return, at a ceremony arranged by a government that had decided, a decade too late, that it owed him something it could not actually give back. Someone who was present, the account surfaces in several memoirs with slight variations, saw Oppenheimer standing alone near a window before the ceremony began, not talking to anyone, just standing there, looking out at the lawn. What he was thinking, nobody asked. What he was feeling, he did not say. He had spent a lifetime saying what he believed with a clarity that frightened people who had more to protect than he did, and it had cost him everything that could be measured and nothing that could not. The Fermi Award was not vindication. It was not nothing. But it was also not an answer to the question he had been posing since he walked out of the desert in July of 1945 and began trying to put into words what it meant that human beings now had the power to end themselves. He died in February of 1967. The hydrogen bomb he had called genocidal was by then deployed on submarines beneath every ocean on Earth, aimed at cities containing millions of civilians, maintained by a logic of deterrence that required each side to keep enough of them pointed at the other to guarantee that any first strike would produce a response capable of ending industrial civilization. The scorpion in a bottle image he had used in 1947 had become operational policy on both sides of the Cold War. The arms race he had argued against had produced an arsenal so large that the number of times humanity could theoretically destroy itself was not a philosophical question, but a calculation someone had actually made and filed. He had been right about most of it. He had said so clearly in the right rooms to the right people at the right time. He had been stripped of the ability to say it in rooms that mattered and handed a medal a decade later by people who found it more comfortable to honor him once he could no longer change anything. The silence after a verdict is not actually silence. It is the sound of everything that was said, filling the space the decision leaves behind. It is the sound of Ward Evans writing a dissent that nobody acted on, and Henry Smith writing another, and both of them understanding that the act of writing it was the only thing left available to them. It is the sound of a generation of physicists calculating, very quietly and very privately, what it would cost them to say out loud what they were thinking. It is the sound of a country deciding that the most dangerous thing a man can possess is not a weapon, but a conscience he refuses to negotiate away. That sound, if you listen for it, has not entirely stopped.